Greetings, everyone. I invite you to continue to keep your videos off and continue to stay on mute. This will help us with our internet connection so that we can hear from our speakers today. Please go ahead and head to the chat. We're inviting folks to chat in there and give introductions in the chat. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers. I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action, and we're so excited to be doing these series of webinars with our coalition partner, United Methodist for Kairos Response. We've been doing this every month for quite a while right now, and have had an amazing turnout and just amazing opportunity to continue to raise awareness and advocacy. Methodist Federation for Social Action is a national progressive social justice nonprofit that mobilizes justice-seeking people of faith to take action on issues of peace, poverty, and people's rights within the church, the nation, and the world. A few announcements about our call today. We are recording the meeting. That recording will be shared by both UMKR and MFSA in the coming days. You'll be emailed this information, so you will have a copy of this recording soon after this call. If you have any questions, please type those questions in the chat. You don't have to wait until we get to the Q&A section. We do ask that from this point onward, that we reserve the chat for questions. This will make it easier for those questions to be directed to our speakers. And if you want to chat with each other, you can talk privately and specifically in the. We are also offering closed captioning for this webinar, so you can access that by clicking on Show Subtitles to the view. Kind of a new thing that we're doing, and so we apologize in advance for any spelling errors and mistakes there. Now I will turn this to our moderator. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Bridget. I'm Sarah Webb Phillips, and I'm pastor at Grace Church in Atlanta. And I am a member of the UMKR Steering Committee nationally. The United Methodist Kairos Response movement is celebrating 10 years and thousands of United Methodists in dozens of UMC annual conferences, whose goal is to bring about a just peace for Israelis as well as Palestinians. UMKR also works with allies in many other faith communities and organizations around the world. Together, we seek to give hope to those whose lives are bombarded by war and military occupation. Our contact is in the chat box if you'd like to know more. I'd like to introduce our speakers today. David Wildman is the Executive Secretary for Human Rights and Racial Justice with the UMC's General Board of Global Ministries and its grassroots partners in the Middle East and Afghanistan. He helped found the U.S. campaign to end Israeli occupation in 2001 and serves as the UMC liaison to the UN as a UN advisor and on the World Council of Churches Palestine-Israel Ecumenical Forum Group. And he is a lifelong New Yorker. Rifat Kassis, a Palestinian Christian, was born in the West Bank. He is an active human rights and political and community advocate, and that has resulted in arrest and prison time by Israelis. He co-authored Kairos Palestine, the Christian Palestinians' word to the world about what is happening to Christians in Palestine. He was the manager of the World Council of Churches EAPPI program that he will refer to in today's topic. He has a daughter and 2 sons and 4 grandsons. And he has also founded the Palestinian section of Defense for Children International, and he is a sought-after speaker and author of numerous books and articles. We welcome these persons, and again, I invite you to put your questions in the chat and remain muted. We'll begin with David.
All right, I think I'm unmuted. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to UMKR and MFSA for organizing these webinars once a month. It's really great. And also I want to just thank Rifat. It's great to have a chance to do this together as friends. We've been in many meetings together, and so being able to share briefly together and respond to questions is a real privilege. I want to give a couple just historical background pieces and then use the United Methodist Church and some of the churches in the US about sort of church involvement with BDS to kind of get to where we are now. And I'll try and do that in a short amount of time. But those who are United Methodists may recall that 1968 was when we merged as a denomination from the Evangelical United Brethren and the Methodist Church. And in 1968, among other things, it was 1 year after the Six-Day War of the Israeli occupation of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. And United Methodists issue a study document at that point calling for an end to all arms transfers, sales, and military aid to the whole of the Middle East. So that call has been a consistent call by United Methodists at every general conference every 4 years since 1968. Now, sadly, the US government has been one of the worst violators of our United Methodist call, though not alone in providing arms shipments and military aid. But I put that out there to say that the concern around Palestinian refugees, around Palestinian rights, and seeking a just and lasting peace for all Palestinians and Israelis has been something United Methodists have cared for deeply for many, many years. In the 80s and 90s, MFSA in particular had a special subchapter that some of you may have been members of, MENUM, the Middle East Network of United Methodists. So we've been active with the First Intifada and even the Oslo period. And UMKR, of course, was formed 10 years ago. So I want to just give that background of United Methodists. Now, we're also divided as a church. So we've also had folks who've been very one-sidedly pro-Israel, Christian Zionists, but that's kind of another topic. Then in terms of myself, my first year in college was when the Soweto uprising took place in South Africa. And I quickly became involved in the divestment movement and did divestment efforts on 3 different campuses as part of the anti-apartheid movement. So it was something that I, like churches, have been doing divestment and trying and struggling on campuses, denominations, etc. I also got involved in 1976 with farm worker boycotts of lettuce and other products until the United Farm Workers could be recognized and agreements with the growers. And so I understood the power of boycotts through learning from workers and the most vulnerable and oppressed. The Nestle's boycott. And I think I'd invite all of you to think about different ways in which you've been involved in boycott or divestment movements in your respective contexts. 1982 was the first year that I became active around Palestine. And that was when Israel invaded the Lebanon to drive the PLO out. And it was massive slaughter, thousands of civilians. But right around the time of that invasion, 1 million people gathered in New York to protest nuclear weapons. But some of the organizers said, we can't say anything about Israel's invasion. And in fact, or we'll pull the funding. And so I suddenly discovered the dichotomy and discrepancy within the peace movement and within churches about being silent and being silenced around Palestine. And so that opened my eyes. I was in seminary and I was like, I've got to do something about that. So I share the background to say that when we moved, fast forward to 2000, 2001, the starting of the Second Intifada, many folks started asking, how do we revive solidarity work here in the US that is committed to nonviolence, that addresses the expansion of settlements and the Israeli military occupation that's been going on for so many years at that point. And that was what led to the formation of what then was called the U.S. Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation, but now is the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. That was done in the context of 9/11, but we felt like even with all this kind of focus on anti-terrorism and the attacks, we needed to lift up Palestinian rights. And it was equal rights for all under international law and freedom from occupation. So in that, very quickly, we started looking at the campuses that were doing divestment movements. So you may remember Berkeley, Harvard, Yale, University of Michigan, and many other campuses in the United States were calling for the students were calling for it, and the trustees were basically ignoring it. And the Zionist pro-Israel lobby was active on campuses to try and challenge that. Now in the churches, the Presbyterian Church, I think, was probably the first ones in 2004 to call for a process of phased selective divestment. And it was folks in the Presbyterian Church that had experiences in the anti-apartheid movement and with farm worker solidarity that saw this as a nonviolent economic tool to pressure the companies that were complicit with the occupation. It took Presbyterians 10 years to move from a call for divestment to actual divestment from 3 companies, Caterpillar, Motorola Solutions, and HP, Hewlett Packard. So United Methodist also at that same time started working at the annual conference level. And I want to kind of frame here, I think one of the things that's both been a strength for us, but also something we need to realize as we face the attacks from the Israel lobby and what's called the Hezbollah campaign of propaganda of kind of challenging and delegitimizing Palestinian rights. And that is that these were grassroots movements, that the grassroots was asking trustees and church bodies to make decisions that, and so it was filtering up at the very same time that the Israel lobby had a top-down strategy to try and silence churches, campuses, and others from making strong statements. Now, one of the significance of churches in the broader movement, once the BNC, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions national movement was launched in 2005 by Palestinian civil society, was the struggles on campuses. There are pro-Israel groups that are members of the campus community and therefore had a legitimate right to speak out as part of the campus, professors, students, alumni. In churches, it was a little different. Christian Zionists tend to be in different denominations. So Presbyterians, United Methodists, the United Church of Christ, Quakers, all had this chance to do something. It was outside efforts to block that. And at first it was divestment only. Then boycott got added with, sort of SodaStream. And I'll just say parenthetically, if folks aren't familiar, like each of these is boycott, divestment, and sanctions are nonviolent strategies of consumers, investors, and of governments applying sanctions to other governments and companies that are engaged in bad behavior, violations of international law. Now, boycott and divestment have emerged globally primarily when the US has vetoed resolutions at the UN to block the international community from engaging in sanctions. So for years, they blocked sanctions on the apartheid South Africa. About a third of the US vetoes were to block criticisms of apartheid practices in South Africa, what's now Namibia, Zimbabwe when it was Rhodesia, et cetera. And half of their vetoes, the US vetoes, were to block sanctions and international criticism against the state of Israel. So when that happens, grassroots movements move to boycott and divestment. So I want, that's just all background to kind of very quickly get to where we're at now. And I think we've moved from the initial efforts from Presbyterians, the American Friends Service Committee, and others from divesting from a couple of companies of like, okay, let's wash our clean hands of Caterpillar isn't changing, so we will divest. Hewlett Packard is not changing, we will divest. to a process of developing a human rights screen that's based on criteria that then can say any company that does not meet these human rights criteria would be excluded. And Westpath, the United Methodist Pension Board, really has done a great job in developing this screen. And they did it in two ways. And I think it's pretty well known that they were wanted something to be that would apply globally to human rights, but also would have minimal impact on their fiduciary responsibilities of the companies that they could select. And in developing that human rights screen, they looked at the list of the worst countries by Freedom House. So there's 10 worst countries like Saudi Arabia, Syria, Somalia, Sudan, North Korea, and a few others. And then added countries that were in violation of international law, International Court of Justice rulings and Security Council rulings. Well, of course, Israel's been in violation of quite a few of those. So the military occupation was a matter of concern. And that's what led Westpath, the United Methodist Board of Pensions, to put 5 banks on that, because those banks were engaged in a variety of activities in settlements. They had settlers that were customers, they had ATMs. Their loans enabled settlement construction and settlement businesses and industries to function. So it was really looking at how to end that corporate complicity so that would be pressure to end the occupation and the ongoing violations of Palestinian rights. Well, that's gotten a lot of pushback by the Israeli government. Now has this Ministry of Strategic Affairs that's designed to really counter boycott and divestment efforts, BDS efforts globally, especially in the United States. And I'll just say briefly, there's over half of US states have now adopted some kind of anti-BDS legislation. And that gets back to what I said earlier about the strategy of the Israel lobby is top down. They can have much more influence and much more effective controlling of politically elected officials who need massive amounts of money for their campaigns. And so those officials were like, hey, if we pass this, it doesn't matter if it's constitutional or not, we'll get campaign contributions. If we don't pass it, our opponents will get campaign contributions. So there was a very kind of quid pro quo. And if you've talked, anyone who's struggled on this at your own state level will know that a lot of the legislators were like, oh yeah, well this, it doesn't really have any impact. But it certainly has a chilling impact on folks who are trying to engage in nonviolent moral actions of boycott and divestments, to say we want to support Palestinians and Israeli human rights groups to end this long-standing violation. I think another piece that's happened, and this is as a result of our movement, is people have seen the racism and really apartheid quality of the occupation, the military occupation, that Palestinians and Israelis, and Rifat is much better at explaining this, are subjected to different rules based on identity. That's the definition of apartheid. And so folks were very nervous about saying apartheid, but more and more churches, more and more media are now talking about Israeli apartheid. And there's efforts at the UN to revive the special committee against apartheid and the Center Against Apartheid, to say that they should look at apartheid anywhere, but one of the most egregious examples of apartheid today is the Israeli practices against Palestinians. Not only in the occupied territories, but also inside the Green Line in Israel and in relation to Palestinian refugees and the diaspora. This summer, we saw a whole struggle around annexation. And I think that churches right now in the BDS movement are at a critical kind of Kairos moment, if you will, and we're not sure where we're going next. So it's kind of like, okay, we've divested from these companies. What now? Do we just add some more companies that we go after? and then more companies, or do we need to look at a different approach? And so I would invite folks, and I hope we can have some discussion about this, of our churches willing to name the Israeli state as an apartheid state, and therefore one that must be subjected to sanctions. And if other governments will not sanction the Israeli state, then it's up to churches and grassroots movements to not only name it as apartheid, but to say we have to block this in nonviolent ways. Take up boycott, divestment, and sanctions even more intentionally to end military aid, to encourage countries in the global south to end the purchasing. Their governments, a lot of India, Brazil, a number of countries are purchasing a lot of military hardware from the state of Israel and from Israeli companies. So just a couple last things, because I know my time is running out and I want to make sure Rifat has plenty of time, that we have an opportunity right now, I think, to really link with Palestinians and a few of the Israeli human rights organizations, B'Tselem and Peace Now and others that are moving. And I've had some conversations with Israelis over the last couple of years, and they were like, we want to ask you about this BDS stuff. And like, we understand if you want to divest, that's fine. We understand if you want to boycott a settlement product. You know, we don't like settlement products either. These are, you know, a few of the sort of, the few progressive Israelis that there are. But this boycott of Israel, we're very nervous about that. And I've responded to them and said, you know, 10 years ago, none of you wanted to boycott settlement products, and said that was hard for Israelis to accept. And now you're saying it's okay. So my sense is we need to push forward with insisting on challenging Israeli apartheid, and insisting on ways to challenge companies to stop their their work with the Israeli state, where they've placed profit before human rights. And we've got a lot of work to do now. It's not easy, but I'll leave it there and look forward to questions, and turn it over back to Sarah and then Rifat.
Thank you. I think you've given us a really good summary of what's happening and what has happened in the past, and you've really given us a challenge right here at the end. So Rifat, let's hear from you.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon and good evening for the ones on our side of the globe. Thank you very much, friends, for inviting me to join this webinar together with my friend David. I'm going to speak about the backgrounds of Kairos Palestine movement and its international coalition and the Cry for Hope call. And I will divide my presentation into three parts. The first one, I'm going to talk about the geopolitical background and the role of politics and politicians that preceded the launch of Kairos Palestine. And the second part will talk about the role of civil society, including churches. And the third part, I'll speak about resistance and hope and the growing movement of hope. Simply, I will speak about the Cry for Hope document. In 1994, there was the first and only serious attempt to end the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian land. And I mean here Oslo Agreement, which was signed between PLO and Israel. This agreement gave some false hope for the Palestinians and showed also the lack of interest of the Israeli society to peace, as it passed in the Knesset with 61 vote only out of 120, so at the margin. It also showed the readiness and easiness of the international community to compromise the Palestinian rights, human rights, and international law in general. To me, Oslo Agreement was ended practically in 1995 with the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister at that time, and the election of Netanyahu in May 1996, till 1999 as new member, as the new prime minister. Netanyahu, a hardliner and rejecter of Oslo and any peace with Palestinians, as he's proving till today, had intensified the settlement activities in the West Bank and did a lot to create a situation and environment destroying the proposed state of the Palestinians, killing practically the two-state solution. Ehud Barak, who was elected as prime minister from 1999 till 2001, although from what so-called Israel center-left, failed as well in granting the Palestinians in the second Camp David with Clinton, and allowed later to broke out of the second Intifada, which had started end September 2000 after Sharon's provocative visit to Al-Aqsa Mosque. And the new national, regional, and international realities emerged with September 11th, 2001, whether it was in the Arab world or in Palestine, like in October 2003, the invasion of Iraq and the occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq. Also on the 18th of January 2002, and this was a very important date because at that time Sharon reoccupied the West Bank and put late Arafat under siege, and this was end March 2002 until he died, and most probably he was poisoned in 2004. And at the same year, Israel assassinated Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas. Another very important event, it was on the 2nd of April 2002, when the Church of Nativity itself was put under the Israeli military siege for 38 days. And the church was closed down for the first time in its history with complete silence and without real intervention, neither from churches nor from politicians. In June 2002, Sharon started building the wall and practically starting to annex the West Bank. So the annexation which we are talking about now, I think this annexation happened in 2002 when the wall was erected, the 712-kilometer long wall, which eats most of the Palestinian land. In end 2003, the UN General Secretary requested the ICJ in The Hague for a legal opinion about the wall and the prolonged occupation of Palestine. Later on the 9th of July 2004, the ICJ, 14 judges out of 15, and guess what? The 15th was an American judge, ruled for the sake of Palestine against the wall and the occupation. Of course, Israel rejected the ruling, and again, the international community failed to honor its obligations and international law. On the 15th of January 2005, Mahmoud Abbas was elected president of the state of Palestine, and later on August 2005, the unilaterally Israeli disengagement from Gaza and without coordination with the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas had created more challenges to the Palestinian Authority. And in 2006, with the Palestinian election, Hamas won over Fatah, but was boycotted by United States and by the EU. This, among other reasons, resulted in a split between both of them, Fatah and Hamas, and a vicious fight started between the two parties where tens of people were killed and maimed, and unfortunately the split is going on till today. Sorry for the lengthy introduction, but I think this was important to explain the situation and the Palestinian frustration, and especially among Christians. To speak a bit about the role of the civil society and churches, and I can summarize it into the following. In 2002, the WCC tried to get engaged in the issue in a more of programmatic way and has established the ecumenical accompaniment program in Palestine and Israel, which I ran for some years, based on a call, of course, from heads of churches in Jerusalem. It started with the hope to have strong advocacy component, but by the time this voice was weakened as Israel created a lot of constraints before the program and forbid people from the accompaniers, from entering Palestine, among them the World Council of Churches Associate General Secretary. On the 9th of July 2005, which David mentioned, and this was 1 year, exactly 1 year after the ICJ legal opinion, a very important development happened with the Palestinian civil society calls for BDS. Simply, they had used positively the legal opinion and did what the Palestinian Authority failed to do. For me, the important point in this call that it came to emphasize the unity of the Palestinian people wherever they live, rejecting the division of Oslo to the land and people. The call spoke about the occupation of the Palestinian land, the racism inside Israel, and the refugees in the diaspora and their right to return. In September 2006, the World Council of Churches Central Committee took a very serious resolution to establish what they call it at that time, Palestine-Israel Ecumenical Forum, PF, as a tool to unite all church efforts working for just peace in the region. And as a first step, on the 20th of June 2007, again, WCC called for a consultation in Amman, Jordan, and had invited many churches and organizations working on Palestine and Israel to discuss together how to concert all their advocacy efforts and work together to bring a just peace in the region. Out of this meeting came a document which was called Amman Call. Although some attendees from European and other church representatives rejected to include the call to BDS, but under the pressure of Palestinian Christian organizations and some of their international partners, the call managed to include a reference on use economic measures as a pressure against Israel to cease its occupation. In that meeting, the concept of costly solidarity was adopted. Costly solidarity. I read once to you, David, you wrote about costly solidarity and convenient solidarity. It seems that the convenient solidarity was much more promoted than the costly solidarity, unfortunately. But as a response, and in early 2008, some Palestinian Christians started their preparation for Kairos Palestine document. And at that time, the main two reasons behind this was, first, to send an encouraging message to our Palestinian Christian brothers and sisters to be patient, to steadfast, and to resist their occupiers, not to sit, observing things. And second, to unite the voice of all Christians in Palestine and send one unified message to their sisters and brothers in the world. So it was just like the manifesto of the Palestinian Christians. In September 2008, there was also an important event which the WCC and the Swiss Protestant churches invited churches and Palestinians to Bern in Switzerland for a consultation about theological topics which usually create friction between churches worldwide, like the Promised Land and the Chosen People, etc. With the frustrated political development, like the war in Gaza in 2008, 2009, and the re-election of Netanyahu in 2009, And the hope which WCC and many churches had showed us at that time, Kairos Palestine as a people document was born. It was both an invitation to the global church to work together and a challenge to them at the same time. It presented a theopolitical response to the suffering of the Palestinian people under apartheid regime, the political crisis, and the split between the Palestinians, which had far-reaching consequences for the Christian community in Palestine. The document was unique because prior to it, churches and Christian organizations tended to reflect individually and in a descriptive manner on the ongoing military occupation of Palestine, of course, with some exceptions, but not jointly. Kairos Palestine was written jointly with such clear and deep socio-political and theological analysis, vision, directions, and action-oriented way. The document got a lot of attention and triggered a lot of positive responses, but also many negative ones. The document was more successful in mobilizing the Christians and Christian institutions and groups at the margin of the church, but with little impact on the official church and leadership. This way, or this was largely due to the hesitance of WCC and other regional ecumenical bodies from adopting and promoting the document among churches and the limitation of PF of taking this rule. As a response, in 2011, Kairos Palestine called for an international conference in Bethlehem to try to establish an international coalition based on Kairos document to influence churches and CROs worldwide. We said if WCC and other regional ecumenical bodies cannot do it, then we should do it ourselves. Out of this conference, a document called Bethlehem Call was issued, but unfortunately did not attract enough attention we thought it will have, and later the coalition just died. In early 2017, the WCC tried to change the mandate of PF and to shut it down, to create an advisory committee to the Secretary General instead of the forum. This step was rejected by the Palestinians, mainly Kairos Palestine, and some of our international partners. And as a response, the National Coalition of Christian Organizations in Palestine, the NCCOP, wrote their open letter to WCC and the ecumenical movement at large. The letter with its 9 recommendations drew some strong attention among many partners and churches worldwide. And WCC had to conduct an ecumenical consultation in Beit Sahur, Palestine on the 20th of June 2017, where the letter was handed officially to the leadership of the WCC. The open letter, it was a joint work with all reputed Christian organizations, and this is something very important. Kairos Palestine was the first time all Christians from different denominations came together to write. And these two things, these are landmarks because they were initiated by the Palestinians themselves. Although the open letter spoke about the urgency of the situation, and I quote, we wrote, "We are on the verge of a catastrophic collapse." And we wrote also that this could be our last chance to achieve a just peace. And as Palestinian Christian community, this could be our last opportunity to save the Christian presence in this land. The WCC did not honor its promises and did not even distribute the letter to its member churches. I mean, we should confess. And we did not receive any answer from any of the regional ecumenical bodies whom we sent them the letter. The only exception was the World Council of Reformed Churches, the WCRC. And again in December 2018, Kairos Palestine called for another international conference to form a new global Kairos for Justice coalition. This time, we did it in a much better way than previous trials and had created it created the coalition with soft structure to run it. More than 20 groups from 20 different countries joined the coalition, and many other groups pledged to work cooperatively with the newly born network. Today, we have tens of movements in more than 30 countries worldwide and managed to develop a unified strategy and created an international coordination committee with different groups to implement the strategy of the coalition. One of these groups was the theology group, who worked together with Kairos Palestine to draft the call, Cry for Hope, which was launched on the 1st of July, 2020. And as David mentioned, there is also the BDS group, whom we are going to launch the BDS toolkit, a study guide for churches on BDS. And this will be launched as a website on the 15th of November, the Independence Day of Palestine. Lastly, to talk about the movement of hope. I like to call it movement of hope, and to speak a bit about the Cry for Hope call. First, for the ones who did not read it, this call, it's a joint urgent call between Kairos Palestine and Christians around the world, translated into 13 languages, endorsed by more than 350 Christian leaders, scholars, organizations, and churches, supported by around 12,000 signatures. It is not any call. It is a call for decisive actions, not words. And decisive actions, not words, means, I'm sorry to put it this way, that we Palestinians and Palestinian Christians, we are fed up from words. Without deeds, without actions, nothing will happen. The matter relates to the integrity of our Christian faith. And different than Amman call, I like to call it, it's a joint struggle and not just costly solidarity. We are struggling together and not someone doing solidarity for another. It is a personal call to all Christians, local parishes, and national churches to engage in process of study, reflection, confession, and actions concerning the deprivation of the rights of the Palestinians. It is an inclusive vision and a call rooted in the logic of love, seeks to liberate both oppressors and the oppressed. In Cry for Hope, we wrote, we make this call out of concern for the future of both peoples. In Kairos document, we wrote, our future and their future are one. Either the cycle of violence that destroys both of us, or peace that will benefit both. It is
Rifat, I don't mean to interrupt too much, but if you could summarize in a minute or so, because you have started us on this vision of hope, and we want time to talk about what our churches can do. So if you could finish up.
Then just to close with that the call has 7 recommendations, which is to learn more about the situation and engage in decisive actions, to confront theologies and misuse of Bible to justify oppression, support Palestinian rights to resistance, including BDS, oppose equating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, and support initiatives between Israelis and Palestinians and interfaith that oppose apartheid, and finally come and see the reality on the ground. And I will end by saying, I mean, we still believe that Palestine is the priority. Without peace and justice in Palestine, threat to the global peace will remain. As we said in Kairos, we believe that our land has a universal mission, and thank you. I'm sorry I took more than what was assigned to me.
No, that's again a wonderful summary of what has happened and leads us into now a time of questions and answers related to the response that our churches can make. Whenever I have introduced the Kairos Palestine document to congregations, I find people are so angered by what's happened and how come they have not known about this. And so I think our first question is a very basic one, but might give us a foundation to understanding. The question is, children who are bullied often grow up to be bullies. Is there a direct or oblique line from the Holocaust to Israel's brutal treatment of the Palestinian, especially those in Gaza? Whichever one would want to respond.
I'm happy to start on that. No, there's not a direct line, but there's no question that the Holocaust has shaped. I can't talk right now. So sorry about that. I just got a call. I think if you look at before the Holocaust, Zionism as a movement within the Jewish community was a minority view. And so one of the impacts of the Holocaust was that and this establishment of the State of Israel is it then became much more of a predominant view. So there is a connection, but I don't see that as a cause. And I think that what's happened is the weaponization of anti-Semitism is something that's very concerning, that there is no moral defense for apartheid practices, for discriminating against Palestinians with checkpoints that are identity-based, closures, tree uprootings, demolitions of homes that are all identity-based only because someone is Palestinian. And so I think anti-Semitism has been used, is ugly, ugly form of discrimination. We had a webinar last month, I think, about this. But it's been weaponized to shift the conversation away from Palestinian being exploited and dehumanized and violated to the Israel as the victim and equating the government of Israel with the Jewish community. And I think that's a big mistake.
Rifat?
No, I mean, for me, I don't like to make similarities between different contexts, but at least what we are trying to do as Palestinians is to work with our children not to become the bullies of the future. And that's why there are more programs of psychosocial counseling and trying to rehabilitate our children in order not to face the same future in the future.
Well, to jump right in, because there's been a couple of comments, is it time for a grassroots and denominational movement to declare Christian Zionism status confessionis and follow the South African model of apartheid? So what steps would you recommend for churches to move in this kind of bold direction?
Rifat, do you want me to go first or you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, either way.
All right. I could say a couple things. One is, yeah, Christian Zionism is problematic theologically, but there's a number of forms of it. And I think it's not about declaring it as bad theology. It's about we need to challenge and engage those in the Christian Zionist movement, because the leadership in that movement, folks like Reverend Hagee and the Christians United for Israel, are really in a very harsh and wrongful way manipulating well-meaning Christians to say their salvation and their well-being in their lives is dependent upon a violent theology that demonizes and destroys fellow Christians and fellow human beings in terms of Palestinians, that this is somehow God's will. And so I think part of it is Kairos Palestine is very clear of rejecting theologies of violence, that somehow we can be the purveyors. So it's more engaging those communities and challenging them than necessarily declaring it. Theological declarations I found rarely work. without the grassroots movement of folks engaging with other congregations, challenging organizations. And one last thing I'll say, Betty McCollum, who's a representative from Minnesota that sponsored the first Palestinian rights related legislation in the US House around no way to treat a child. Her letter in response to AIPAC, she instructed AIPAC when they accused her of being anti-Semitic to say, I am instructing my staff not to answer letters, not to answer phone calls, and not to schedule meetings with anyone from AIPAC until you've apologized in writing. And that's the kind of thing we need to begin to do with the Christian Zionist community, which includes many, I would say, that have accepted this kind of post-Holocaust Jewish-Christian dialogue dynamic, but that's a larger question too.
You know, for me, I mean, maybe I should confess that, I mean, we used status confusionis in the cry for hope, but we used it in its historical context. Because, I mean, in our area, many of our members in Kairos, they did not like to atonement each other's, because we live in an area where, I mean, every group, I mean, speaks against the other group. So we have a lot of groups confronting each other and trying to atonement each other. So I go also for what David, I mean, spoke, although there are some sector of Christian Zionists, which is, I mean, completely irrelevant to dialogue with them and to talk to them. But here I would like to talk about the initiative of the Bible College in Bethlehem Bible College, and their regular conference, Christ at the Checkpoint, where they targeted the evangelical movements. And I can say that they are doing excellent job. They are doing very good job. And many of these evangelicals were transformed after giving, I would say, giving them the opportunity to see the reality with open heart and mind. Some we can dialogue with them, some others, I mean, these ideologists, it's very difficult to dialogue with them, and this is also from our experience.
Rifat, you were ending your comments relating to the action statements. And so for you and for both of you, how can we move our church members from prayer to advocacy and working for justice as a spiritual journey? How do we help that movement that engages our actions where our deeds have to be a response to the words that we offer? So what would you say to that?
David, you go first, or you want me to go first?
No, we should rotate a little bit.
Yeah, okay. No, I think that the first step is that we need to give as much information as we can. We need to educate even our friends and our partners. And sometimes we think that this issue is completely understood, but actually it is not. So sometimes we need just to repeat. So information and encountering, we need to talk, we need to discuss things. And that's why, for instance, in Kairos Palestine, and also we repeated it in Cry for Hope, we said, come and see, because we feel that this personal touch, to listen to each other narratives, to listen to our stories, these are very important points to start with. So information, education is one thing. The second thing is that we need to give examples, we need to give ideas to our supporters to implement, to do things. Sometimes, for instance, if we ask people to write letters to so-and-so, they will not write it. But maybe if we can give like some sort of templates for people. I mean, we need to make it easy for people to join the struggle. Also, I mean, being on the streets on special events, this is something very important. Bring the cause of Palestine, justice and truth into the life of the church, whether it was on Sunday prayer, but also on the special events of churches. This is also something we find it very important. Such webinars, I think these are also good opportunities to create an opportunity for people to get involved and to be active. This is what I can think of right now. Maybe David, you can enlighten us more.
Yeah, I would thank you, Rifat. I'd say the response to that is oftentimes we're attacked of like, well, that won't work. So BDS won't work. And what I've found helpful is to say, fine, that's your opinion. What nonviolent actions are you doing?
Yeah.
And to come back to sort of, if you want to join EAPPI, become an accompanier for 3 months, be on the ground. If you want to join Christian peacemaker teams, and that is your nonviolent action to protect Palestinian children, to make their way to school, great. You don't have to do BDS. That's a terrific thing. If you're working 100% to kind of stop military aid, great. That's actually sanctions. So to help shift the conversation, not from can that work, is it possible, what can I do, to what nonviolent actions can I take in partnership and in solidarity with Palestinians, with Israeli peace groups, with the global community that will make a difference. Because what I found is that critics, the easiest way to stop our work is to say it can't be done. And so to look at two things I'd lift up is in the Gospel of John, it says, the truth will set you free. We as Christians still believe in the truth. We have a government in the United States and too many governments around the world that don't believe in truth. But we still have to, as Rifat said, get that education out. And the second is in Luke 18, one of my favorite texts is the widow and the unjust judge. The widow had no power. Like a geopolitical analysis would have been, she should be quiet and just kind of take care, survive. But she went to the unjust judge and kept challenging him. That's the kind of Palestinian notion of samud, of steadfastness and persistence to kind of keep at it. And we need to understand our work as a politics and practice of erosion. And you don't erode injustice overnight. So my sense is help folks get on, as Rifat was saying, join the movement. It's not like you have to do everything right away, but what's the one thing you're starting with now and inviting your neighbors to join in with?
Thank you. Our time's about at hand. For those who can, we'd like to go another 5 minutes or so, just to dig a little deeper into what our churches might could do. One question is, do the Palestinians know what Christians are doing here? Are they aware of our BDS efforts?
Yeah, I mean, you know, from our side as activists in organizations, we try our best to publicize these information as we receive them. We try to keep the public informed. And all these, I mean, activities like boycotting or divesting from companies benefiting from the occupation, they are very much appreciated locally. So we try our best to publish this. And I mean, there are, before COVID-19, definitely, there were many American groups who visit Palestine. And these are not regular, how you call them, pilgrims, but they are pilgrims from different styles that they meet. They go and see people in their own context and listen to our stories and communicate with us. Also, thanks for the American churches. Usually they invite Palestinians to attend their general assemblies and synods, whether as delegates or as observers and listeners. So there are some opportunities here and there that create some information, some awareness about what's going on. And we try to transmit this to our public and to our people. Again, this come and see thing, it was a very good tool and opportunity for Palestinians, and I think also for Americans to learn about each other's stories.
Yeah, I would just add to what Rifat said briefly is that if anyone doubts the power of boycott and divestment, look at what COVID has done in terms of it's shut down the tour industry that has been a significant part of the Israeli economy. Not for good reasons. I don't want to, but it's been quite tragic, but it shows that a concerted effort, even of a small number, can really make a difference. And some of the companies that are being engaged right now and challenged are the travel companies like TripAdvisor, Bookings Holdings, Airbnb, that all have tours and places to stay that are in the Israeli settlements in complete violation of international law. And so I think we need to realize also that we have some power to make a difference, but we need to be in touch and keep learning what's happening in Palestine, in Israel, and also what one another is doing here.
Well, thank you both for engaging us in this time. You will see in the chat that there are recommendations and suggestions of organizations, and certainly working with both Methodist Federation and UMKR. I think this has given us some thought of what can happen next, as well as we partner with our Christians in Palestine and learn from them as well. I want to remind you that on November 18th, UMKR will have a 10th anniversary celebration and reflection and recognition of those working on Palestinian rights within the United Methodist Church. And there'll be information about that, and you're welcome to join us. On December 9th, our next webinar will be Christmas in Bethlehem, and we will hear from the Palestinian community in terms of their celebrations and, again, challenges for us. This falls one day before the December 10th Day of Human Rights and December 11th, which is the anniversary of the UN resolution of the right of return for Palestinians. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you, David and Rifat, for sharing with us.
Thank you.